Stop what you're doing right now because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about missing children cases. Forget everything you've heard about search parties combing forests for days. Forget the tearful parents begging for their babies to come home. This case, the disappearance of 6-year-old Lilly Sullivan and her 4-year-old brother Jack, is nothing like that. In fact, the most terrifying part of the story isn't what happened in the woods. It's what happened before anyone even started looking. And here's the twist that should make your blood run cold. The police knew something was wrong from day one. Not because of what they found, but because of what they didn't find. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. As if two small children simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a story so full of holes that even the forest refused to hide the truth. Before I go any further, if cases like this one, stories that dig deeper than the headlines and ask the questions no one else will, hit that subscribe button now because you're going to want to follow where this goes. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why this case has haunted investigators for years. May 2nd started like any other spring morning in rural Nova Scotia. The sun filtered through towering pines, morning dew clung to wild grass, and the air smelled of earth and cedar. But inside a small mobile home tucked deep in the woods, something was terribly, impossibly wrong. At approximately 9:40 in the morning, two adults finally woke up. Not to the sound of children playing, not to laughter or questions, or the patter of little feet. They woke to silence. Malaya Brooks Murray, the children's mother, and her boyfriend Daniel Martel claimed they had slept in late, far later than most parents would dare with 3 young children under one roof. When they emerged from their bedroom, 2 of those children, Lilly and Jack, were gone. Just gone. The sliding glass door at the back of the trailer was closed. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication that anything violent had occurred. According to their story, the children had simply wandered outside to play, slipped through that door without making a sound, and walked into a forest so dense and unforgiving that even experienced hikers think twice before entering. But here's where the story starts to crack, and I mean really crack, like ice over deep water. Lilly, the 6-year-old, was supposedly sick that morning. Sick enough to be kept home from school. So sick, in fact, that she hadn't attended class in days. If that's true, if this little girl was unwell and under her mother's care, then why were both adults still asleep well past 9:30? Who was watching her? Who was monitoring her symptoms, her temperature, her needs? And more importantly, who was watching 4-year-old Jack, a child barely out of toddlerhood, wandering freely in a home surrounded by wilderness? Daniel Martel said he realized the children were missing around 10 in the morning. He said he immediately grabbed his keys and drove around the property, scanning dirt roads and checking culverts, looking for any sign of them. Malaya, according to her own account, called the police almost right away. Almost. That word hangs in the air like smoke, because in cases like this, almost isn't good enough. Every second counts. Every minute a child is missing, the radius of possibility expands. Abduction, injury, exposure, drowning, each scenario becomes more likely with every tick of the clock. And yet, the timeline they provided, even from the very first report, felt stretched, vague, like a story told by people trying to remember a script instead of reliving a nightmare. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived, they did what they always do. They asked questions, took notes, assessed the scene. But something didn't sit right. The officers could feel it. You don't work missing persons cases for years without developing a sixth sense for when a story doesn't align with reality. And this story, right from the start, felt off. The parents said the children had been playing outside. But where? There were no toys scattered in the yard, no evidence of recent activity, no trampled grass or disturbed soil in the areas where children typically play. The adults claimed the kids must have wandered into the woods. But why? What would compel 2 small children, one of them allegedly sick, to leave the safety of their home and walk into a forest with no clear path, no destination, no reason? The RCMP began their search immediately, and it was extensive. Helicopters swept overhead, their rotors echoing through the valleys. Drones equipped with thermal imaging cameras scanned the canopy. Ground teams, some made up of trained search and rescue volunteers with decades of experience, moved methodically through the underbrush. 9 units were deployed, dogs trained specifically to detect human scent, both living and deceased. These aren't just pets with good noses. These are animals capable of detecting a single skin cell in a football field. They can find a person buried under snow, hidden in a car trunk, submerged in water. They're that good. And yet, they found nothing. Not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not a broken branch or a disturbed patch of moss. Not a single scent trail leading away from the house. It was as if Lilly and Jack had simply ceased to exist the moment they supposedly stepped outside. Searchers described it as eerie, unsettling, wrong. One volunteer with over 30 years of experience in search and rescue said he'd never seen anything like it. Children leave traces. It's unavoidable. They touch things, they drop things, they leave footprints, scent particles, disturbances in the environment. Even in the worst conditions, heavy rain, dense fog, there's usually something. But here, nothing. Let me put this in perspective for you. The area around the Sullivan home was actually ideal for tracking. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for holding footprints. The forest was dense, yes, but it was also cool and moist, conditions that preserve scent exceptionally well. If those children had walked into those woods, the dogs should have found their trail within hours. Instead, the K-9 unit circled, confused, unable to pick up even the faintest trace. It was as if Lilly and Jack had never been outside at all. And that's when the investigation shifted. Subtly at first, then unmistakably. Because when children vanish without leaving a single piece of evidence behind, when the story told by the only witnesses doesn't match the physical reality, investigators stop looking outward. They start looking inward, back toward the house, back toward the people who are supposed to be protecting them. Now, here's a detail that should send chills down your spine. Only one piece of potential evidence was ever noted near the property. 2 small footprints, barely visible, found approximately 10 feet from the back door. Just 2. Not a trail, not a path, not a series of steps leading anywhere. Just 2 isolated prints in the dirt, as if someone had placed a child's feet down once, then picked them up again. If 2 children had been playing outside that morning, running around, exploring, laughing, there should have been dozens of prints, maybe hundreds. Children don't stand still. They move, they jump, they run in circles. But there were only 2 prints. 2 prints that raised more questions than they answered.
Think about that.
Picture it in your mind. 2 children, ages 6 and 4, supposedly playing freely in their backyard on a spring morning. Where are the other footprints? Where are the signs of movement? Where is the evidence of life? The answer, the one that investigators began to suspect within the first 24 hours, is that there isn't any. Because maybe, just maybe, those children never made it outside. Maybe whatever happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan happened inside that trailer, behind closed doors, where no one could see and no one could hear. But the parents stuck to their story. They were asleep. The children were playing. The door was open. They wandered off. It's simple, tragic, but simple. Except nothing about this case is simple. Because as the days turned into weeks, and the search efforts expanded and then contracted, and then stopped altogether, more and more inconsistencies began to emerge. Small details that didn't line up. Timelines that shifted. Statements that contradicted earlier statements. And at the center of it all, 2 adults who seemed more concerned with controlling the narrative than finding their missing children. I want you to think about something. If your child went missing, if your baby disappeared without a trace, what would you do? Would you sleep? Would you eat? Would you be able to sit still for even a moment? Or would every fiber of your being be screaming to search, to move, to do something, anything, to bring them home? Most parents in these situations become almost feral with grief. They don't sleep, they don't rest, they claw at the earth with their bare hands if they have to. But Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks Murray, they gave interviews. Calm, collected, scripted interviews. And that's where this story takes its darkest turn. So stay with me, because what comes next isn't just suspicious. It's damning. If you're already feeling that knot in your stomach, that sense that something is very, very wrong, then drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from because this story is about to get even more disturbing. When someone's child goes missing, you expect raw emotion. Tears, desperation, panic, anger, anything that signals the complete psychological breakdown that comes with losing a child. What you don't expect is polish. You don't expect rehearsed answers, steady eye contact, and talking points repeated word for word across multiple interviews. But that's exactly what Daniel Martel gave the world. From his very first appearance on camera, something felt off. Not wrong in an obvious way, not suspicious in the sense that he was fidgeting or avoiding questions. No, it was the opposite. He was too smooth, too controlled, too ready with his responses. Like an actor who'd rehearsed his lines until they became muscle memory. Watch enough true crime, and you start to notice patterns in how people speak under stress. Innocent people tend to ramble. They circle back, contradict themselves, struggle to find the right words because their brains are drowning in cortisol and adrenaline. Guilty people, on the other hand, tend to over-prepare. They craft a narrative, memorize it, and deliver it with eerie consistency. And Daniel? He sounded like a man reading from a script he'd written himself. In one interview, he said, "I'm still holding out hope. I don't know why they didn't find anything. Nothing from Jack's pull-up, nothing from her backpack or any of her belongings at all. They just haven't found anything." In another interview, days later, he said almost the exact same thing. Same phrasing, same cadence, same pauses. It wasn't a man grasping for words. It was a performance. A calculated, controlled performance. And it wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. There was no tremor in his voice, no catch in his throat, no moment where emotion broke through. Just steady, even delivery, as if he were describing a lost set of keys rather than two missing children. Malaya, on the other hand, presented differently. Where Daniel was smooth, she was fractured. Her sentences didn't quite connect. She stumbled over words, avoided direct eye contact, and most tellingly, she rarely used the word I. Everything was we. We woke up. We realized they were gone. We called the police. It's a subtle linguistic tell, but it's significant. When people diffuse responsibility through language, when they make every action collective rather than individual, it often signals an attempt to distance themselves from personal accountability. She wasn't taking ownership of the events. She was spreading the blame, diluting it, making it harder to pin anything specifically on her. But here's where it gets truly chilling. In multiple interviews, both Daniel and Malaya described Lilly and Jack in a very specific way. They didn't talk about how much they loved them, how much they missed them, how scared they were for their safety. Instead, they focused on one particular trait. The children, they said, were too trusting, too friendly. The kind of kids who would talk to anyone, go with anyone. Let that sink in for a moment. Your children are missing, and instead of defending their innocence, instead of painting them as cautious or protected, you describe them as vulnerable, as easy targets.
Why?
Because it builds a narrative. It primes the audience to believe that what happened was external, that some stranger took advantage of their trusting nature. It subtly shifts blame away from the parents and onto the children themselves, or onto some faceless predator lurking in the woods. It's a classic deflection tactic, and investigators recognized it immediately. In cases like this, parents typically do the opposite. They insist their children would never go with a stranger, that they'd been taught to be careful, that something terrible must have forced them away. But Daniel and Malaya? They laid the groundwork for an abduction narrative before anyone even suggested abduction was a possibility. And that's not grief. That's strategy. Then came the polygraph. In the court of public opinion, lie detector tests carry weight. They're not admissible in most courtrooms, but to the average person, they represent a clear line between truth and deception. So when Daniel Martel publicly announced that he had requested a polygraph test, many people saw it as a sign of innocence. Here was a man willing to put himself under the microscope to prove he had nothing to hide. Except that's not quite what happened. Daniel didn't just request a polygraph. He insisted that it could only be conducted by a specialist flown in from outside the region. He claimed that there weren't enough qualified examiners in Canada, that the RCMP needed to bring someone in, someone with particular expertise. And that request, innocent as it might sound, accomplished something very specific. It delayed everything. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police is one of the most sophisticated law enforcement agencies in the world. They have access to trained polygraph examiners, forensic specialists, behavioral analysts, everything needed to conduct a thorough investigation. The idea that they would need to fly someone in, that they lacked the resources locally, doesn't hold up under scrutiny. But by insisting on this condition, Daniel bought himself time. Time for memories to fade, for public attention to drift, for the initial heat of the investigation to cool. And in criminal cases, time is everything. The first 48 hours are critical. That's when evidence is fresh, when witnesses' memories are sharpest, when the psychological pressure on suspects is at its peak. After that, the window starts to close. People lawyer up, stories solidify, forensic evidence degrades. So when Daniel Martel made his polygraph request, he wasn't cooperating.
He was stalling.
And investigators knew it. But here's what the public didn't see, what wasn't broadcasted in those carefully edited news segments. Behind the scenes, the RCMP was conducting their own analysis, and it wasn't focused on the forest. It was focused on behavior. Behavioral analysis is a critical tool in missing persons cases, especially when there are no physical leads. Investigators watch how people move, how they speak, what they prioritize. And what they saw in Daniel and Malaya didn't match the profile of distraught parents. Distraught parents are chaotic. They interrupt each other, they talk over investigators, they demand updates every few minutes. They can't sit still, they can't focus, they can't perform normal functions like eating or sleeping. But Daniel and Malaya? They gave interviews. They updated their social media. They appeared composed, almost detached, as if they were observing the tragedy from a distance rather than living inside it. One investigator later described their demeanor as oddly transactional, as if they were managing a crisis rather than mourning a loss. And that distinction matters, because grief and guilt look very different under pressure. Grief is messy, uncontrollable, visceral. Guilt is calculated, defensive, and performs. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, okay, this is already disturbing, but how much worse can it get? Then you need to make sure you're subscribed, because we're just getting started. The cracks in the story are about to turn into chasms, and what happens next with Malaya, the mother who is supposed to be the emotional center of this tragedy, is something you won't believe. She didn't just step back from the investigation. She disappeared.
Completely.
And the way she did it, the timing, the method, it all points to one very dark conclusion. If you're already feeling uneasy, wait until you hear what happened during that search meeting, the moment everything fell apart. Drop a like if this case is already getting under your skin, because trust me, it's about to get a whole lot darker. Picture this. You're in the middle of the largest search operation your rural community has ever seen. Volunteers are combing through forests, helicopters are circling overhead, reporters are gathering for updates, and law enforcement is coordinating every available resource to find your missing children. This is the moment when a mother would be front and center, pleading for information, thanking searchers, doing anything and everything to keep her children's faces in the public eye. But Malaya Brooks Murray did something else entirely. She disappeared. Not metaphorically. Literally. During a scheduled search meeting, with law enforcement present, with volunteers waiting, with the media watching, Malaya quietly stepped away from the gathering. She walked to an ambulance parked nearby and climbed inside. And she never came back. No explanation was given. No medical emergency was announced. No statement was released about what happened inside that ambulance or why she needed to be there in the first place. She simply exited the narrative mid-scene, as if she decided the performance was over and it was time to leave the stage. Daniel Martel, her boyfriend, later claimed he had no idea where she went. He said she'd cut off all contact with him, blocked his number, refused to communicate. For a couple that had been presenting a united front just days earlier, this sudden fracture was jarring. But it wasn't just the physical disappearance that raised eyebrows. It was what came next. Days after vanishing from the search efforts, Malaya briefly reactivated her Facebook account. Not to post about her missing children, not to plead for tips or share updated photos. She changed her relationship status to single, updated her profile picture, and then deactivated the account again just as quickly. Let me repeat that because it's important. While her 6-year-old daughter and 4-year-old son were still missing, their mother's priority was updating her relationship status on social media. Not organizing search parties. Not coordinating with investigators. Not holding on to hope. She was erasing digital ties to Daniel Martel and scrubbing her online presence clean. This isn't grief. This is damage control. Think about what that behavior signals. When someone in the middle of a criminal investigation suddenly severs public ties with their co-parent, when they go dark on social media and refuse to communicate, it suggests division, disagreement, or worse, it suggests that one party is trying to distance themselves from a story that's about to collapse. In criminal psychology, this kind of strategic withdrawal is often seen when co-conspirators begin to fracture under pressure. When the heat gets too intense, when investigators start asking harder questions, when the story that two people agreed upon starts to show cracks, that's when the alliance breaks. And that's exactly what appeared to be happening here. Malaya wasn't stepping back to grieve in private. She was fleeing. From the investigation, from Daniel, from the narrative they'd constructed together. But investigators don't just let people disappear, especially not in cases involving missing children. The RCMP continued trying to reach her, to interview her separately, to understand why she'd suddenly become unreachable. And while the public details of those attempts remain sealed, what we do know is that her withdrawal marked a turning point. Because from that moment on, the case stopped being about two missing children wandering into the woods. It became about what happened inside that house before anyone started looking. And if Malaya had information, if she knew something that contradicted the story Daniel was telling, her silence wasn't protecting her. It was incriminating her. Now, here's where the timeline becomes crucial and why investigators were so focused on Malaya's behavior. According to the official report, Lilly and Jack were last seen on the morning of May 2nd. That's what the parents told police. That's what was released to the media. That's what the entire search operation was based on. But school records told a completely different story. Neither Lilly nor Jack had been seen since Tuesday, April 29th. The school bus driver confirmed it. He picked up kids on his route every morning, and the last time he saw those two children was 3 full days before their parents reported them missing. 3 days. That's 72 hours of unaccounted time. 72 hours where, according to every external witness, Lilly and Jack Sullivan simply didn't exist. No one saw them Wednesday. No one saw them Thursday. And yet, on Friday morning, their parents called police claiming the children had been playing outside just hours earlier. Why the gap? Malaya's explanation was that Lilly had a cough, that she'd kept both kids home from school to care for them. But there's no medical record of a doctor's visit. No pharmacy receipts for cough medicine. No texts to teachers explaining the absence. Just 2 adults, alone in a house with 3 children, and 2 of those children vanishing during a window of time when no one else was watching. Investigators refer to April 30th and May 1st as the gap days, and they're some of the most scrutinized hours in this entire case. Because if something happened to Lilly and Jack, if they didn't wander into the woods on May 2nd, then when did it really happen? And more importantly, why did their parents wait 3 days to report it? That delay, that gap, it's not just suspicious. It's a window for concealment. Time to clean, to move, to alter a scene. Time to craft a story. Time to make sure that when investigators finally arrived, there would be nothing left to find. And that brings us to one of the most shocking decisions in this entire investigation, a decision that stunned the public and signaled to many that police knew far more than they were letting on. Despite 2 small children being reported missing in a remote, wooded area, despite the parents claiming a possible abduction, despite the massive search efforts underway, no Amber Alert was ever issued.
None.
No emergency broadcast, no highway signs, no notifications sent to every phone in the province. Just silence. Amber Alerts are designed for exactly this kind of situation. They're not just for confirmed abductions. They're tools to mobilize public awareness when a child's life may be in danger and when time is critical. But in the case of Lilly and Jack Sullivan, authorities made the conscious decision not to activate one. And that decision speaks volumes. Because Amber Alerts require certain criteria to be met. There has to be a reasonable belief that the child is in imminent danger. There has to be enough descriptive information to make the alert useful. And critically, there has to be belief that the child is actually missing, not that something else has happened. The absence of an Amber Alert in this case suggests that from very early on, the RCMP suspected that Lilly and Jack weren't out there to be found. That this wasn't an abduction or a case of children lost in the woods. It was something else entirely, something that had already happened, something that no alert could fix. And if the police believed that, if they believed from day one that those children were beyond saving, then the entire public search, all those volunteers, all those helicopter flyovers, all of it was theater. A necessary procedure, yes, but one conducted with the grim understanding that they weren't looking for survivors. They were looking for evidence. So when Malaya Brooks Murray climbed into that ambulance and disappeared from public view, when she cut ties with Daniel and erased her digital footprint, she wasn't running from grief. She was running from accountability. And investigators knew it. But knowing and proving are two very different things, especially when the evidence, or lack thereof, seems designed to lead nowhere. If this case is already making you question everything, then do me a favor. Hit that like button because we're about to dive into the timeline that investigators were actually following, the one that started 5 days before the parents ever called police. And when you see the surveillance request the RCMP made, when you understand what they were really looking for, you'll realize that this case was never about a search. It was about a cover-up. Tell me in the comments, do you think Malaya ran because she was guilty, or because she knew Daniel was? Because what comes next suggests that someone, maybe both of them, knew exactly when those children disappeared. And it was May 2nd. There's a moment in every investigation where the official story and the actual evidence collide so violently that the entire case pivots. Where what people claim happened becomes impossible to reconcile with what can be proven. In the disappearance of Lilly and Jack Sullivan, that moment came when investigators started talking to people outside the family. People who had no reason to lie, no narrative to protect, no story to maintain. And what those people said shattered everything. The school bus driver was the first crack in the facade. His name was never released publicly, but his statement to police was unambiguous. He drove the same route every weekday morning, picking up children from rural properties scattered across the region. He knew his passengers, knew their routines, knew their faces. And he was absolutely certain that the last time he saw Lilly and Jack Sullivan was Tuesday, April 29th. Not Wednesday, not Thursday, and definitely not Friday, May 2nd, the day their parents claimed they'd vanished.
Tuesday.
3 full days before the police were even called. Let that timeline settle in your mind for a moment. Because if the bus driver is correct, and there's no reason to believe he isn't, then Lilly and Jack Sullivan were already gone long before their parents reported them missing. They were already gone when Malaya claimed she kept them home because Lilly had a cough. They were already gone when Daniel said he woke up late and realized they'd wandered outside to play. The entire story, the sliding glass door, the morning disappearance, the immediate search, all of it was constructed around a timeline that didn't exist. But the bus driver wasn't the only witness. Teachers at the local school confirmed that neither child had attended classes that entire week. No phone calls had been made to explain their absence. No emails sent. No notes. Just silence. In most school districts, when a child misses more than 2 consecutive days without explanation, the administration reaches out to the parents. But in this case, in this small rural community where resources were stretched thin and communication wasn't always reliable, that protocol hadn't been followed. And so Lilly and Jack Sullivan slipped through the cracks, unnoticed by anyone except the 2 people who were supposed to be caring for them. Now, Malaya's explanation for keeping the children home was simple. Lilly was sick. She had a cough, maybe a cold, nothing serious but enough to warrant staying home from school. And since Jack was younger and Lily's brother, it made sense to keep him home too rather than send just one child to school. On the surface, it's a reasonable explanation.
Parents do this all the time.
A child gets sick, you keep them home, you monitor them, you wait for them to feel better. But here's where that explanation completely falls apart. There is no medical record of Lilly being sick. No doctor's appointment scheduled or attended. No prescriptions filled at any local pharmacy. No over-the-counter medications purchased. No thermometer readings logged. No calls to a nurse hotline, nothing. In the age of digital footprints and paper trails, there is zero evidence that Lilly Sullivan was ill during those 3 days. And even if she had been, even if Malaya had decided to treat a minor cough at home without medical intervention, that still doesn't explain the silence. It doesn't explain why she didn't call the school. It doesn't explain why she didn't notify anyone that her children would be absent. It doesn't explain why, when Friday morning came and those children were supposedly missing, she didn't mention to police that they hadn't been seen by anyone outside the home in 72 hours. Because that's critical information. When a child goes missing, investigators immediately want to establish the last confirmed sighting by an independent witness. It helps narrow the timeline, helps determine when and where to focus search efforts. But Malaya and Daniel didn't volunteer that information. They let police believe that Lilly and Jack had been seen that very morning, that this was a fresh disappearance, that the trail was still warm. And by the time investigators talked to the bus driver and the teachers, by the time they realized the real timeline, precious hours had already been lost. Hours that could have been spent investigating what actually happened during those gap days instead of searching woods for children who were likely never there. Investigators began referring to April 30th and May 1st as the gap days, a term that sounds almost clinical but carries devastating weight. Because those are the days when everything could have happened and no one was watching. Those are the days when Lilly and Jack Sullivan existed only within the walls of that trailer, isolated, unseen, vulnerable. Those are the days when, if something went wrong, there were no witnesses, no oversight, no one to intervene. And here's what makes this even more chilling. During those gap days, there were no welfare checks. No relatives stopping by. No friends visiting. The family was completely isolated in that remote property, surrounded by forest, with the nearest neighbor far enough away that they couldn't hear or see what was happening. It was a perfect window. Perfect for an accident to occur without immediate discovery. Perfect for a tragedy to be concealed. Perfect for a story to be crafted. Think about the psychology of waiting 3 days to report missing children. What kind of person does that? What kind of situation would make that seem like the right choice? There are really only a few possibilities, and none of them are innocent. 1. The parents genuinely didn't realize the children were missing, which would require a level of neglect so severe it borders on criminal. 2. They knew the children were gone but were searching on their own first, hoping to find them before involving authorities, which makes no sense given the terrain and the danger. Or 3. They knew exactly what happened to those children and needed time to prepare before facing investigation. Option 3 is what the evidence keeps pointing toward. But let's go back to that Amber Alert, or rather, the lack of one. Because this is where you really see the RCMP's hand, where their suspicions become visible even though they're trying to maintain operational security. An Amber Alert requires specific criteria. The child must be under 18. There must be reason to believe the child is in imminent danger. There must be sufficient descriptive information to assist in recovery. And there must be belief that an alert will actually help. In the case of Lilly and Jack Sullivan, all those criteria should have been met. 2 young children, allegedly missing in a remote wilderness area, potentially abducted given the parents' suggestions about their trusting nature. Every news outlet in the province was already covering the story. The public was engaged, concerned, ready to help. An Amber Alert would have put their faces on every phone, every highway sign, every news broadcast across the region. It would have mobilized thousands of additional eyes. But it was never issued. And that decision, that very deliberate decision, tells us what police really thought. They didn't issue an Amber Alert because they didn't believe those children were out there to be found. They didn't believe this was an abduction or a case of kids lost in the woods. They believed, from very early on, that Lilly and Jack Sullivan were already beyond help. That this wasn't a rescue operation. It was a recovery operation, if anything could be recovered at all. And that assessment, that grim calculation, was based on more than just the timeline discrepancy. It was based on everything investigators were seeing and not seeing at the scene. Which brings us to one of the most damning pieces of evidence in this entire case, or rather, one of the most damning absences of evidence. Remember, Daniel Martel claimed that Lilly was wearing specific items when she disappeared. She had her backpack, the white one with strawberries on it. She had her pink boots. She had her pink blanket, her comfort item that she carried everywhere. These weren't vague descriptions. These were specific, detailed items that should have been easy to spot in a forest, especially that backpack and those boots. Bright colors, synthetic materials, things that don't blend into nature. The kind of items that search teams train specifically to look for, because they stand out. Search and rescue volunteers were told to watch for these items. They were given photos, descriptions, told that finding any one of these belongings could be the break they needed. The dogs were given scent samples from the children's clothing, trained to alert on anything that carried their smell. Drones with high-definition cameras flew grid patterns over the search area. Every hollow log, every culvert, every dense thicket was examined. And they found nothing. Not a backpack, not a boot, not a shred of fabric. Nothing. For 4-year-old Jack, Daniel's description was even more specific, at least initially. He said Jack was wearing only a pull-up diaper and his blue boots with dinosaurs on them. A 4-year-old in nothing but a diaper in the Nova Scotia wilderness, even in spring, would be in immediate danger of hypothermia. That detail alone should have triggered maximum urgency. But here's where the story started to change. In later interviews, Daniel described Jack differently. Now the boy was wearing brown pants and a brown shirt, fully clothed. No mention of the pull-up. No mention of being barely dressed. The description had completely changed, and no explanation was ever given for why. When a parent can't accurately describe what their child was wearing the morning they disappeared, that's not a memory lapse. That's a fabrication falling apart. Because if you really saw your child that morning, if you really watched them walk out that door, you would know what they were wearing. You would remember. That image would be seared into your brain, replaying on an endless loop. But if you didn't see them that morning, if you're creating a story after the fact, trying to fill in details you can't actually recall, then yes, those details would shift. They would change as you tried to make the story more believable, more complete. And then there's the pink blanket, Lilly's comfort item. Daniel told investigators early on that the blanket had been found near the house, that it was already recovered. But weeks later, an audio recording surfaced, and in it, a woman's voice believed to be Malaya's suggests that the blanket might still be out in the woods somewhere, that search teams should keep looking for it. So which is it? Was the blanket found? Or is it still missing? How can both parents give contradictory information about such a specific, important item? The answer is simple. They're not working from memory. They're working from a script, and scripts change when different people tell them, especially when those people aren't communicating anymore. Every one of these inconsistencies, taken alone, might be explained away. Stress, grief, confusion, all of that can impact memory and communication. But taken together, these aren't the signs of traumatized parents struggling to recall details. These are the signs of a manufactured story coming apart at the seams. And investigators were documenting every contradiction, every shift, every moment where the narrative didn't hold. Because in cases like this, the truth doesn't change. Lies do. Now, if you're thinking this can't possibly get any more disturbing, I need you to stay with me because we haven't even gotten to the physical evidence yet, or rather, the complete and total absence of it. We haven't talked about the dogs that should have been able to track those children through any terrain, any weather, any condition. Dogs that have found people buried under avalanches, hidden in vehicles, submerged in water. Dogs that never fail. Except this time, they did. And when you understand why, when you hear what the experts couldn't explain, you'll realize that this case stopped being a mystery and became something much darker. If this story is pulling you in, if you can't look away, then make sure you're subscribed because the next part, the search that found nothing, is where this case goes from suspicious to something that investigators will tell you, off the record, haunts them to this day. Tell me in the comments, do you think those children ever left that house? Because everything we're about to examine suggests they didn't. And if they didn't, then where are they? In any investigation, consistency is everything. When witnesses tell the same story multiple times and the details remain stable, that's a sign of truth. Truth doesn't shift because truth isn't something you have to remember, it's something you lived. But lies require maintenance. They need to be kept straight, rehearsed, coordinated between people. And when the pressure mounts, when the questions keep coming, when the scrutiny intensifies, that's when lies start to fracture. That's when small details that seemed insignificant suddenly become critical. And in the case of Lilly and Jack Sullivan, the details didn't just fracture. They shattered. Let's start with something that should have been simple. What was Jack wearing when he disappeared? It's a straightforward question, the kind any parent should be able to answer without hesitation. But Daniel Martel gave two completely different answers, and the contradiction between them reveals something deeply disturbing about the entire narrative. In the initial reports, Daniel told police and media that 4-year-old Jack had been wearing only a pull-up diaper and his blue boots with dinosaur prints when he went missing. Picture that for a moment. A 4-year-old child, barely past toddler age, wandering into a dense Nova Scotia forest in nothing but a diaper and boots. No shirt, no pants, no jacket. This was early May, spring in the Maritimes, when morning temperatures can still drop near freezing. A child dressed like that, exposed to the elements, would be in immediate life-threatening danger. Hypothermia could set in within hours, maybe less. That detail, that specific horrifying detail, should have been the driving force behind every search effort. It should have been repeated in every media appearance, every press release, every public plea. A nearly naked child in the wilderness. Every second counts. But then something strange happened. In later interviews, Daniel's description changed completely. Now Jack was wearing brown pants and a matching brown shirt. Fully clothed. The pull-up was never mentioned again. The vulnerable, exposed child became a child dressed appropriately for being outside. And nobody questioned it. Nobody asked Daniel why his story had changed. Nobody demanded an explanation for how a parent could be so fundamentally wrong about what their child was wearing the last time they saw them. Think about your own children or children you know, or even just think logically about how memory works in crisis. If your child disappeared, if the last image you had of them was walking out a door, what they were wearing would be burned into your mind. You would see it every time you closed your eyes. Every detail would be crystallized, frozen in that moment of terror when you realized they were gone. The color of their shirt, the fit of their pants, whether they had shoes on, whether they were dressed warmly enough. Those details wouldn't be fuzzy. They would be painfully, perfectly clear. So how does a parent get that wrong? How does the story go from nearly naked and vulnerable to fully clothed and prepared? There's only one logical explanation. Daniel Martel didn't actually see Jack that morning. He wasn't recounting a memory. He was constructing a narrative, and as the investigation progressed, as he realized how certain details sounded, he adjusted the story. The pull-up made Jack seem too vulnerable, too obviously in danger, which made the parents' delay in searching seem even more negligent.
So the story changed.
Jack became clothed, which made the scenario more plausible, more survivable, less immediately damning. But Daniel wasn't the only one whose details shifted. The pink blanket, Lilly's treasured comfort item, became another point of contradiction that investigators couldn't ignore. According to multiple sources, Lilly carried this blanket everywhere. It was her security object, the thing she held when she was scared or tired or needed comfort. If she had really wandered into the woods voluntarily, it's entirely possible she would have taken that blanket with her. Children don't abandon their comfort items. They cling to them, especially in unfamiliar or frightening situations. So finding that blanket should have been a priority. It was bright pink, a color that would stand out against the browns and greens of the forest floor. And, according to Daniel's early statements, it had already been found. He told investigators the blanket was recovered near the house, implying it had been located quickly and was no longer part of the search. But then, weeks later, an audio recording emerged. The source of the recording was never officially confirmed, but analysis suggested it was from internal communications, possibly recorded during search coordination efforts. In this audio, a woman's voice, believed to be Malaya's, mentions the pink blanket. But she doesn't say it's been found. She says search teams should keep looking for it. She suggests it might still be out in the woods somewhere, waiting to be discovered. So which is it? Was the blanket found near the house, as Daniel claimed, or is it still missing, as Malaya suggested? How can both parents, both of whom should have the same information about evidence in their children's disappearance, give completely contradictory statements about such a significant item? The answer, once again, points to a story being managed rather than remembered. Daniel said it was found because having it found near the house supported his narrative that the children had been playing in the immediate area before wandering off. Malaya, possibly not knowing what Daniel had already said, or possibly no longer coordinating her story with his after their split, mentioned it as still missing. Neither version was ever officially confirmed by police, which suggests that the blanket's actual status, found, missing, or never existed in the first place, was something investigators were keeping close.